So welcome everyone to the Peoria Riverfront Museum's Art Club, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Heather Placco, the program's manager, and I'm very excited to be hosting artist Margaret Le Jeune for today's Art Club presentation. Questions and comments are welcomed at the end of the presentation. At that time, I'll invite you to unmute yourself, or alternatively, if you don't wish to talk, I'd invite you to type the question into the comments section, and I'll ask the question for you. So without further ado, a big welcome to Margaret.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I'm going to get my screen situated here. Okay, how does that look? Good? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Well, thanks again. Thank you everyone for joining me. I'm really delighted to be here today and be talking with you about my work. I've spoke at the Peoria Riverfront Museum before when the Emergence Central Illinois, Artists of Central Illinois presentation was up. So maybe I'll touch on a little bit of those things today. If you saw that presentation, it'll just be part of this. Otherwise, today I'm going to talk about a new body of work that I've been currently generating. So I'm starting today with this slide called Drawn to the Sea, because most of my work over the last 8 years has been about the seas and the ocean. This is a drone shot that I took of my boat while we were anchored off the coast of Maine. So I want to talk a little bit about the way that I make work. I consider myself to be an expeditionary artist, someone who finds travel, curiosity, research, and then the understanding of local knowledge and sort of this idea of like local to global applications as the reason that I make my work and the way that I make my work. So I have this like deep-seated need to see different cultures and spaces and places. My research usually begins with reading. I'm really drawn to the writings of John McPhee, Carl Safina, William Warner, Rebecca Solnit, Jennifer Price. A lot of those are environmental historians who are weaving together these complex ideas about sort of the environment and the history and the way that humans have affected the environment. I'm really interested in how local knowledge plays into my research as well. So when I travel to a place, I often spend time with local archives or meeting with local people who can sort of give me insight into how a place has changed or what it's been like growing up there, so that I can try to get the largest view of a place as possible and have like this deep understanding of the culture in the place. As an academic photographer, my interest is to make work that has like this global outreach and it can inspire conversations about important things like climate change and sea level rise and ocean warming temperatures, habitat loss, species loss, and most recently I've been reflecting on ideas about time, and that has definitely been inspired by the pandemic. So I'm going to break my talk into a couple of different sections today. Expeditions at sea and expeditions on land, though in the end you're going to see that these two are quite interconnected. And so again, this is my boat Bear, anchored off of a small island, again in Maine. I spent the last 8 years or so living part-time on my sailboat and traveling the Atlantic coast of the US from Maine to Florida, but also down to the Caribbean, to the Bahamas, the Turks and Caicos, Puerto Rico. I usually live aboard my boat for 3 months every summer when I'm not teaching, although I was really fortunate in 2018 to be able to move aboard my boat and live aboard my boat for 15 months during a sabbatical. And during that time was when I was able to cruise down to the Caribbean and just have a quite amazing adventure. So I like to tell people that sailing is more than bikinis and beautiful sunsets and cocktails in the cockpit. It's a lot of hard work maintaining a sailboat, especially when you're in very remote areas where you have to become the sail repair person, the refrigerator repair person, and any other system on the boat. You really have to be able to take care of yourself. And those challenges have really changed sort of the person I am over the last 8 years. being a woman on a sailboat in a typically male-dominated industry and field has really given me a lot of insight into the ways that women are treated in the marine industries. And I've forged a lot of relationships with other women sailors in ways to help each other out. There's a great network of women called Women Who Sail on Facebook. And it started out as this little teeny tiny group of just a couple hundred people around the world when I first started. And now it's 18,000 people. And there's literally a woman in any port. And if you need help doing something, you just hop on this group and she will literally come get you in her car and take you to the grocery store. It's such an amazing thing and really helped restore my faith in humanity. So in addition to being the refrigerator repair person and the sailmaker, etc., one of the other things that's really important to being a sailor is looking at the weather. So I've had to learn how to read weather maps and do weather routing and think about the ways in which the weather affects the sea state and whether or not I can make a safe passage. So what I'm showing on the screen right now are just a couple examples of the wind mapping software that I use before making a trip plan. So if you look like on the image on the right-hand side, you can see those very dark red areas are areas you would want to avoid. The one down at the very bottom, that dark area with a little bit of black on the image on the right-hand side is the formation of a hurricane in the Caribbean. And so thinking about days ahead of time, making plans, and thinking about what it might mean to be able to make a passage and whether or not you should venture out is something I think about quite a bit. So being at sea has really allowed me to travel to a lot of amazing places while at the same time maintaining a low carbon footprint. I'm harnessing the power of the wind rather than burning fossil fuels. And I feel like that's one small way that I can be a better steward of our planet. It can also be quite a bit of fun. Sometimes it gets a little bit sporty out there with a bit of wind and you've got a lot of sea kicking up onto the boat and it feels like it's a race against the elements. This is a shot from one of my favorite places that I've sailed to. This is Leinster Bay on St. John in the US Virgin Islands. This is part of the national park down in the islands. And so the land, a huge portion of St. John and the area around it in the sea are protected. I had the fortune of spending 2 months living in our boat in this bay, Leinster Bay, in 2019, volunteering to be a bay host for the Park Service. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. And one of the added joys of sailing is my ability to learn about the diversity of marine creatures. This is an image of me snorkeling in the British Virgin Islands. Being able to be close up with fish and turtles and octopus and sharks and corals and a variety of other sea creatures has dramatically altered the way that I see the world. As I experience the intelligence of these beings, I question the hierarchy that relegates humans as the top species on our planet. I spend a lot of time thinking about the ways I can make work that will show the interconnectedness of all life, from the microscopic sea creatures to the keystone predators like wolves, to the complex network of fungus in the forests. And a lot of time my work happens in the littoral zone. This is the area between the hard land on a map and the sea, a space that is constantly in flux. It's also one of the richest areas of biodiversity on the planet. In this space, I've collected specimens and made photographs. On the right-hand side of the screen here that you're seeing is a digital photograph of a cyanotype that I created from a piece of kelp. So you've got this like meta piece here, a photograph of a photograph, you know, a document of a document, as I'm trying to think about photographers who've come before me and made these collections of biological matter, like Anna Atkins did in the 19th century with her books on things like seaweed and sea kelp and other animals and you know, other plants. So my desire is often to create photographs that are like pauses, right? So you pause in front of this work, and I want the viewer to think about what their own relationship with the environment might be. And to hopefully spark an interest in the wonders of the sea. This image was shot in the British Virgin Islands, and I think it's really a great metaphor for our precarious position in the current climate chaos. The human scale Jenga that you see there, is a game that's constructed just out of reach of the tide, and it speaks to our hubris and inability to take our situation seriously. The Jenga is always just about to topple over, and we keep poking at it and poking the blocks of it out and seeing if we can beat it. And I just thought that this was a perfect reference for the ways in which we're now dealing with and not dealing with the climate crisis. So as I mentioned, I'm going to share with you two projects. The first is an art sci project that explores some non-human species that act as indicator species for climate change. This first project is called Growing Light, and I began this project in 2015. The project sort of focuses on bioluminescent organisms. And in the oceans, bioluminescent organisms make up about 85 to 90% of marine life, meaning that all of those organisms in some way or another express the ability to have bioluminescence, or this glowing light, come from them. And the reason for that light is they vary. Some of the organisms are using it for attracting mates. Others are using it as sort of subterfuge so they're not eaten. I'll talk a little bit about some of those. So these are a couple examples of bioluminescent organisms. On the left-hand side, those are anglerfish. And if you saw the movie Finding Nemo, one of the fish that has the light dangling in front of its head, that's one of these anglerfish. In that little dangling lantern, they have a bacteria called Vibrio fischeri that causes the bioluminescence to occur. And then the bobtail squid over on the right-hand side, this is a little teeny tiny squid. They're found quite a bit in Hawaii. And you can see their whole body lights up with that same bacteria called Vibrio fischeri. So after sailing in the Chesapeake and seeing some of this bioluminescence in the water, not these creatures here, but a different kind of organism, I became really fascinated with what I could do with photography and this bioluminescent light. So I started growing Vibrio fischeri in my studio. I reached out to a couple of scientists working at the Harbor Branch Oceanic Research Institute in Florida, and they sort of gave me a recipe for how to generate ocean water in my studio, and taught me how to pour plates, auger plates, and things like that. And I became a scientist in addition to an artist in my studio, and I became fascinated with growing these organisms. And so, as sort of a beginner to using this light to make photographs, I started placing the Petri dishes on top of black and white photographic paper to explore what the sort of exposure time would be of the organism throughout its life cycle, how often I would need to culture the organism to keep it alive, because it's living in a Petri dish. It eventually sort of eats up all its nutrients and then suffocates itself as it continues to grow if there aren't more nutrients, or I'm sorry, if there aren't more bits of auger that it can sort of eat off of. So as I was working with these black and white images, it's a like inexpensive way to work with photography and start thinking about how long the organisms need to be on top of the paper to create the widest range of blacks and whites. So how can I get that sort of deep range of tonality in the works? So after I sort of sorted that out, I started to work with color film and other kinds of bioluminescent organisms. This one here is an example of an ostracod, which is a tiny, it's like the size of a sesame seed organism that is related to shrimp. And it expels bioluminescence when it is trying to escape a predator. So it sends off this like plume of what we would think of as almost like smoke, but it's actually this bioluminescent glow, and it confuses the predator and they are able to escape. But what we have found is that you can actually collect these organisms and dry them, and you can order them from a scientific supply store, and they come dried out. But if you reanimate them by just adding water, they come to life again and they glow again. And so in my studio, I started reanimating them and putting them on top of color film sheets. So like 4x5 or 8x10 color film sheets that you'd use in a large format camera, and making what we call photograms. So direct contact images to create the image. So in this case here, I'm kind of squishing this tiny ostracod, which is already dead, but being slightly reanimated. It's this strange like life-death situation we have to create the light of this image here. And then I started playing with, thinking a lot about content and how I could talk about how the dinoflagellates or the other bioluminescent organisms relate to climate change, and how I could use them to sort of speak about the changes to the ocean. And one of the ways that I started doing this is I used those reanimated ostracods to literally draw or paint on the surface of the film these shapes that resemble hurricanes or severe weather patterns that have really ramped up over the last 20 or 30 years in the Caribbean. So here I'm like referencing the shape of a spiraling hurricane that's moving across the islands. And I was really thinking a lot about Irma and the hurricanes that cause a lot of destruction in that area. So I also work with dinoflagellates, as I mentioned, which is what most people refer to as sea sparkle. These organisms light up the beaches in places like Bioluminescent Bay in Puerto Rico, and several other places where people vacation to see the glowing sea around the globe. These organisms are really important to the food chain in the oceans. They're the largest food source for marine organisms. So they're really, really important to the sea. And in this image here, I'm again growing these in my home studio. I've created this one during the pandemic, but I'm literally growing these in a globe, and then I've made digital image of this where the organisms are moving around in the water. And I think that it really references like the idea of planetary life. So while those dinoflagellate organisms can be really beautiful, they are also the same species that causes red tide or harmful algal blooms. And you've probably seen this in the news quite a bit, over the last few years, because we've had a lot of these red tide events occurring off the US coast. And these harmful algal blooms, they are devastating to coastal regions. They cause mass die-offs of fish. They totally destroy the tourism because the organism actually can make humans really sick as well. They make the air smell really acrid and terrible. And literally the beach would be littered with dead marine organisms if you were to visit there. And these are just a couple images to show you what red tide can look like. And I'm going to talk a little bit in the next slide about how that relates to the dinoflagellates I'm working with. So as a way to talk about the complexity of like these organisms in the sea and the way that it relates to climate change, I created this work called the Watershed Triptych. The images you see here are the 3 largest agricultural watersheds in the United States. On the left-hand side is the Mississippi watershed. In the center is the California Central Coast. And on the right-hand side is the Chesapeake Bay. And in the last slide, I mentioned that the dinoflagellates cause these red tide algal blooms. And that phenomenon happens when there's an overabundance of nutrients in the water at a place where the ocean temperature is starting to rise. So these nutrients actually come from large industrial factory farming, which is why I chose these 3 largest agricultural watersheds to depict in this image. So when the excess nutrients run down the rivers, right, all the tributaries of the Mississippi or all of the tributaries in the California coast, they eventually empty out into the ocean. And over the last 30 years, the Gulf of Mexico, the Pacific coast off of California, and the Atlantic coast off of the Chesapeake and the estuary of the Chesapeake itself have had a huge increase in these red tide events. So what I've done is I've taken USGS hydrology maps And I have literally put those on the surface of film. And then I've used the light of the bioluminescent organisms to illuminate those maps of a photogram. So instead of using like the light from a enlarger, I'm instead using the light from the bioluminescent organisms. All right, I'm going to switch gears now and talk about the new work. This is a work in progress, so I feel like it's sort of like showing someone your sketchbook. So bear with me, there's a lot of unfinished ideas here, but I love sharing new work with, especially with new groups of people, because I feel like there's always the opportunity to have a conversation that sparks a new idea, or perhaps there's something that you've read or a movie you've seen or a poet that you like that is really making ideas that are, dovetail well with what I'm exploring right now. And you might be able to recommend something to me that I could check out. So in 2019, I came back from that 15-month sabbatical at sea and had no idea that the world was about to drastically change, right? The pandemic started to change our lives in early 2020, and my expeditionary practice was completely sidelined. I had to cancel a trip to Bermuda where I was going to go photograph a glowworm mating ritual that happens on the third day after the full moon during the summer months, but that was nixed. I had an artist residency scheduled for Trout Lake Research Station in Wisconsin to work with another scientist who works on bioluminescent organisms. That's been put on hold indefinitely. And sailing was even out of the question because states were requiring really strict quarantine from travelers by land or sea, and the logistics of getting things like fuel and water, and even trying to get groceries and things like that seemed like it was too much of a challenge to our personal safety, but also to the safety of our communities. So as spring sort of shifted into summer and then back into fall again, I knew that I had to get back to the sea somehow, but sailing wasn't going to be a possibility. So rather than putting the boat in the water, I decided I would try to be as flexible and resilient, I feel like that word's been thrown around a lot, but as possible, and try to reimagine a new way of knowing the ocean. So my spouse and I decided to pack up our apartment. We put it all into a storage unit. We bought this camper van, which is 19 feet long. It's a very tiny space. And we moved into this camper van and set out for the Pacific Northwest. I was both fortunate and unfortunate, depending on how you want to look at it, to be transitioning into teaching fully online at Bradley during this time as a way to keep everyone safe. And, so that allowed me to travel, but it was also a real challenge to be able to get internet, to be able to, keep up with my classes and be able to meet with my students on things like Zoom like this. So we headed out west with the goal of seeing as much of the coast as possible, from the California-Oregon coast north to the Straits of Juan de Fuca. I had never seen Northern Oregon or Washington State at all. And so I felt like this was a really great way for me to complete my understanding of what the ocean coasts of the United States look like. As I mentioned before, tides, I've been thinking about tides and looking at red tides, but also needing to understand how tides work as a sailor. So I've been thinking about these ideas for several years. And when I research things, I often, I obviously need to know things like how to read weather and tide charts and things like that, but also really am interested and curious about the history of our understanding of tides. And so I dove real deep into Alexander von Humboldt's work. He's been quite a bit of a rock star recently. There was a really great exhibition of his work and artists inspired by his work at the Smithsonian recently. And so what I'm showing you on the screen right here is sort of a diptych of an image that I created at Westport Beach in Oregon, paired with an 1823 map that Humboldt made, where he's mapping the isotherm bars, which essentially are color-coded ways in which he's showing the temperature similarities across the planet. So that really inspired me. And I'm looking at his mapping of that, and at the same time, I had been creating maps of my own while I was living in Leinster Bay down in the USVI, one of the things that I did is I helped map the ocean floor of the bay to help with the hurricane cleanup, because Maria had devastated that area and littered along the entire floor of that bay were pieces of boats, roofing from houses, and all sorts of detritus. And so using my underwater camera and a GPS unit, I marked all of the things that the divers could eventually come along and pull up from the ocean floor. So while I was out in the Pacific Northwest, I found myself again examining that littoral zone that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, thinking a lot about the cycle of the tides and the ways in which we measure time. Because I don't know about you, but the pandemic just sort of stopped time for me. There was just this, I couldn't remember what day of the week it was. Everything seemed to just blur together. Days stretched into weeks, stretched into months, and the pandemic felt like it was never going to end. And as time slowed during this process and my idea of what the post-pandemic world might look like, I could not help but think about how time is perceived and how it's recorded by nature. Everywhere I turned, the sea was showing me ways it marks time, with sand drawing at low tides in conjunction with shells and pebbles washed ashore, to the ephemeral sea breeze creating drawings of shoreline plants. I started pairing together historic imagery of the way that we record tides. So the earliest tides were measured by their harmonics. So this measuring of the sound of the waves allows us to understand the ways in which tides stretch around the world. And this is an early map of that. And this image on the right-hand side is an image I created at the Pistol River in Oregon. And so this to me is sort of reminiscent of what we call a flat lay in commercial photography, where you're photographing, the commercial object, say makeup or shoes or something like that, laid flat and lit from above. And in this case, you have the seaweed, which is laid flat and being photographed, but the flatness is created by the tide. So solastalgia is a term that means a deep longing for home or the natural world that we know is never coming back. And this idea of solastalgia was just overtaking me the entire time I was out there. And I, started making these images again, thinking about what is time? B, where do we fit in time? And what does the future look like? And by future, I don't mean 2 weeks from now or 2 years from now, but what does 2,000 years from now or 4,000 years from now look like? And how will those people look back at us? And what will they think of how we treated the planet? And as the weeks turned into months on the road, I continued to investigate this idea. Time was showing itself to me everywhere I looked, in rock strata, in tree rings, in the sand, in the markers for high water that I found in every small town, every small coastal town that I visited. And if you look, I know I don't have a pointer, but you can see the high water mark labeled on that pole. And then you look way up in the air and, we're talking like 35 feet as high water. And this is, I don't know, probably half a mile inland. At public beaches, I, sat a lot and listened to people from afar talk about the places that they were, their experiences with the sea. And I had this just great fortune of watching these children play with bubbles. And as their bubbles were floating down the beach and just gracefully floating over the water, I couldn't help but think those were markers of time. And also the precariousness of life. And there were many places that I, sort of walked and just looked at the ways in which people wanted to be memorialized. There were several places where people had carved sayings or their names into the rocks at the water's edge. And to me, it was like this relationship with nature as the tide is carving itself into the rock and letting itself be known. We're also competing with it as we're trying to mark our sort of property or our place. To me, it was a very interesting relationship. I began to wonder which came first, the tides or time. Our bodies are estuary, they are stream, they are watershed. Our bodies are made of the same water that rained down in the Amazon, that dripped from the falls at Niagara, that splashed ashore in the Abacos. We are not hermetically sealed bodies, but we are ephemeral parts of a much larger system. I began to see time as a continuum, with tide as an event temporarily drawn in the sand. I became really interested in this idea of geomorphology, which is the study of landforms, their processes, the form itself, the sort of sediments, the science into looking at how the landscape works with the Earth's surface processes, like how air, water, and ice, they all mold together to shape and form our landscape. And, you know, in the middle of this climate crisis, and we think about things like the melting polar caps or the dramatic shifts in temperatures that we're seeing. These are disrupting the coasts, right? They're disrupting the rocks, the strata, all of those things, and they're making permanent changes in these places that, again, 10,000 years from now, someone's going to be able to read in the same way that we read ice cores. In some places, I just stopped and, you know, silently thought about what the landscape meant. I found it almost difficult to take a bad picture in the Pacific Northwest. And I don't say that with an ego, I just mean that the place is so incredibly beautiful and inspiring that everywhere you turned, it seemed the picture making possibility was just enormous. And I felt like the landscape was just telling me to make these photographs. And I kept creating these like little bits of poetry and posting these to my Instagram and Facebook page. With this image here, I wrote, "The earth breathes with purpose. Dunes are built by the wind to create a natural buffer at the edge of the littoral zone." You know, and I marveled at the way that the ocean created its own clouds. And, you know, we know through science that the water evaporates out of the ocean and it moves around in our atmosphere, right? All of these things are related, but I kept seeing these enormous cloud formations on the beach of the ocean foam. And it was literally as if the beach was speaking to the sky. It was so beautiful. So I'm continuing to look for these metaphors in the landscape. I think about sort of some of the terminology that I've heard used during the pandemic, and I was trying to relate that back to this idea again of like time and what that means. And I came to this this term, tidal volume, which is actually the medical term for lung capacity during respiration. So again, there was like these threads that continued to weave themselves just naturally through this work. And I'm thinking about the ways that we might be remembered, you know, as I'm thinking about these deep time ideas, both looking at the geology, right, of the rocks along the shores, but also thinking about what the future of the planet looks like. I wonder what it means to be a good ancestor. And I couldn't help but thinking about that idea specifically when I came across this area. I'm trying to remember exactly what the name of this beach was called. Hobbit's Beach Trail is where this was. And carved into the rock and placed in several nooks and crannies along this edge of the littoral zone were these little sort of shrines. And people had brought plant matter and candles and all sorts of things like that. And clearly this was a place that had been revisited many, many times over and over again. But I couldn't help but also think about how each day, the tide came up and washed away these shrines, these special places. And so I kept, again, thinking about what the oceans mean to us. What does it mean to set something out to sea? What does it mean to allow the tide to cleanse us? Right? There's so many metaphors for the ocean and water and the idea of tide and time. And I feel like I'm just starting to scrape the surface of what some of those ideas mean. So that's the end of my presentation, but I really welcome any conversation or suggestions about the work.
Wow, thank you, Margaret. They were beautiful, your photographs and learning about it. So if anyone has any questions, I'd invite you now to go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question verbally, or if you'd like me to ask a question for you, you can type it in the chat box and Margaret and I will answer those questions. And Margaret, it's quite interesting that you're working with bioluminescence, or we're working with bioluminescence. Next summer, the museum's going to have a show all about creatures of light, creatures that produce bioluminescence, and exploring them.
Wonderful.
So it's a fun little tie-in. So we'll have to talk to you again then next summer.
Yeah, I'm actually have a sort of another new project that I'm working. I like to work on multiple projects at a time in case, you know, because I don't know, it sort of inspires me in different ways. But so the new project that I'm working on is called Illuminating the Sixth Extinction. And I'm again using bioluminescent organisms, but I am having the organisms, I'm giving them agency to actually create the works. And so the organisms are walking on the film and things of that sort. And I'm using specifically organisms that have seen a massive decline in their species, like certain kinds of fireflies and certain kinds of fungus even are seeing these massive declines in these numbers. And so that's sort of in the works as well.
Wonderful. Kurt, did you have a question?
Yes, Margaret, that was a very fascinating presentation you gave. Could you speak a little bit about what got you started on this investigative journey of nature?
Sure, thank you so much. You know, when I moved to Peoria, that is really when it started. Before I moved to Peoria, mostly made portrait work, and my portraiture was what's called environmental portraiture, which means essentially that you're photographing the person in a particular place, right? So I did a big series that took me about 5 years, 6 years, called The Modern Day Diana, where I photographed women hunters in their homes. And I traveled all over the country for that. And, you know, I really would just get in my car. Any woman who said yes, she'd let me photograph them, I would drive to go make their picture. And so I think I've always really enjoyed traveling. And when I moved to Peoria, I had just gotten together with my spouse and we started sailing together. He had sailed his whole life, but he was teaching me how to sail. And the more and more that I saw the oceans, the more I really started to understand just how poorly we were taking care of them. And so I started to really think about how I could make work that would help sort of elevate some of these concerns. And I also tried to incorporate that into my classes. I teach a class called Art in the Environment at Bradley, and the students made this really incredible installation at the Peoria Children's Playhouse, all about oceans, and we used recycled plastics that we collected from the community. And so it's just sort of been a sort of a natural progression, I think, over the last maybe 10 years or so that I've become really interested in these environmental issues.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question from Ricky. What advice do you have for building to more complicated art and figuring out how to get to your goals? They are a grade school teacher.
Yeah. For me, the idea of research is always sort of fundamental to each of my projects. So, or even in my teaching, you know, I like to start off by reading everything I can get my hands on about an idea that I'm interested in. And that gives me this like foundation of not only understanding like the big sort of ideas, but also even having the language to use to be able to talk about, what I'm trying to get at. So, I don't know, a year ago or so, I didn't know what geomorphology was, right? This was something that I learned through reading articles and, asking people. Like, nobody can work in a bubble, right? Like, we think of science as this like naturally global phenomena that occurs where scientific data is shared and measured around the globe. And a lot of times we think as artists as these like solo hermits that live in their home and, try to protect their ideas. But really good artwork comes from a network. And I think that, sharing ideas and talking about ideas helps you to enrich and deepen the process and the goals. So for me, like if I get an idea, say the bioluminescent idea, I knew I wanted to make work with these organisms, but I had never poured a petri dish. I had never, I had no idea what it meant to raise these things in my studio. And so I just started sending some emails to some people who were working in the field. Bradley went over and talked to the people working in marine biology and the Olin and science department. And I just started expanding my network, and who was ever willing to sort of help me along the way. I was much in gratitude toward them, and give prints to people who helped me with things like that. And that's how I grow my projects. I know everybody works differently, but for me, the research, the archives, the like getting at the nitty gritty, seeing what people have already done in that sort of area of interest, like looking at everyone who's ever done something with bioluminescence in art, that obviously takes months to do, right? To just scour the internet and talk to a librarian, because those people are the best at finding the information for you. Like, that's how I, sort of get deep into something. And I think about my projects as long-term always. Like, nothing is, I usually don't do like a one-off piece. It's usually many, many years that I invest into each of my projects.
Thank you. And my apologies. Ricky's a grade schooler, not a grade school teacher.
Oh, wow.
Grade schooler. So thank you for your question, Ricky. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, thank you, Ricky.
And this is from Holly. How do you decide the best angle for photographs? Do you take multiple and pick your favorites, or is it more intuitive?
Yeah, great question. I take a lot of pictures. I usually, if I sort of see the vision in my head, that's the first picture that I take, is that first one. And then I try to take a couple steps forward, take a couple steps backwards, kneel down on the ground, stick my camera up in the air, always play with depth of field. Like, what does it look like if everything is in focus, or I create a shallow depth of field and just the main subject is in focus. A lot of the works that I made on the beaches that you saw, I would try to literally walk every angle of that area to see where the light was falling the best. Because I feel like with photography, if the light isn't good, the pictures, only so. So I really spend a lot of time thinking about, is the light saying what I want it to say? And if it's not, how do I get it to say that? And sometimes for me, that actually means, all right, I got to look and see when the sun comes up in that location. And then I got to figure it out, go online or something, look it up. And I got to make a note to come back to that location to make that photograph. So I think not rushing, when I'm trying to make a good picture is really important. Just sort of realizing that you found it, right? That's like half the battle. You found the place. And then how do you like take the time to really capture what you want to say?
Absolutely. Out of curiosity, Margaret, what kind of camera do you use?
I use a lot of different kinds of cameras. The digital camera that I shoot with right now is a Sony A7 III. I shoot with a Hasselblad film camera, which is a medium format camera. I have a drone that I use to take a lot of aerial works, and I've been doing quite a bit of video with that drone recently. I really love to shoot with a large format film camera, the kind where you pull a dark cloth over your head. But since I was living in a 19-foot van since October, I couldn't take that camera with me. So I was mostly shooting with the digital camera. But one other thing that I do quite a bit is sort of like I mentioned, like sketches and sketchbooks and things like that. And sometimes I just want to make like a small memento or document of a place that isn't a digital image. And so I usually bring with me sheets of pre-coated cyanotype or old black and white photographic paper for, that you would use in a darkroom. And I create these little, cyanotypes, like I showed the one of the kelp piece, or they're called lumen prints when you use the black and white paper as a photogram. So you literally can like take a flower and put it on top of the black and white paper out in the sunlight, and then just let it sit there for a few minutes or a few hours, and you'll get an exposure that is ephemeral. So it won't be fixed, it won't stay. But if you put it in a dark bag or a dark place, it won't fade. So I sort of hold on to those as like transient memories of places. So sometimes if I can't have a camera with me, I can always make an image like that.
It's very interesting. Is there a way to affix an image on those, or will they always fade no matter what?
Yeah, the lumen prints, so the black and white paper ones that you make out in the sun, you can fix those like in regular darkroom chemistry, except the like tonality and the colors become a lot less vibrant. I really love them when they turn like blue and pink and purple, and that sort of fades to like oranges and browns if you fix it. So that's why I often don't fix it. And if I want to exhibit those, I'll scan them and then print them.
Do we have any other questions for Margaret? I have one final just note that I wanted to mention. In your pictures of the Pacific Northwest and even some of the southern states, you were showing pictures of the beaches and things. A lot of them also reminded me of the Great Lakes beaches. Have you done any work in the Great Lakes beaches in Michigan or anything?
I have very recently, actually. When we first bought the van, we did kind of a crazy way to get to the Pacific Northwest because we actually wanted to go check on our boat, which was in Florida, but we headed up through Michigan, and I ended up photographing, Lake Superior and then Lake Erie. And there was quite a bit of flooding going on at the time. So it was really some really interesting photographs from that. And I'm trying to sort of figure out a way to incorporate that work into another body of work that I made while I was on my sabbatical, which is sort of all about the ways that we live along the shore, right? And like, how do we both see, having a ocean view as both something that is really beautiful, but also something really troubling? And, how do we navigate those internal conflicts that we're now having, right, about building on the shorelines? And again, this comes back to this hubris about being able to control nature, right? Like, there's no way we can't control the change that is happening right now in any measurable way in the immediate, right? We can change it over the long haul, but there's no way to stop, this massive increase in hurricanes and such in the short term. And so what does that mean for us economically? What does that mean for us in terms of how we live in cities, coastal cities? So yeah, that body of work I hope will include that Great Lakes imagery that I created.
Very cool. Kristen would like to know what your next project is.
Yeah, so I think that I am working on this piece right now, this series called Illuminating the Sixth Extinction, and actually writing some grants, writing to try to get some grants for this project, because I'm eager to travel, once we can travel again safely, to cryogenic zoos and other zoos, regular zoos as well, where we are holding on to the last examples of certain species, be it they're still alive or be it we have them in their DNA form in these cryozoos. And so I want to create those images in conjunction with some of the bioluminescent organisms that I'm using, like the fireflies and the fungi, to really talk about how this extinction is happening, even though you're not really seeing it most of the time, right? Like the extinction is happening, but it's kind of under the radar because like there's this thing called the windshield effect. And I always use this as an example. When I was a kid, we used to drive to Louisiana, where my father was from. And in driving, your windshield would be covered in bugs, just absolutely covered. You'd have to pull off on the side of the road and you'd have to clean the windshield off. That doesn't happen anymore because we have lost so many of our insects. So what is that telling us, right? That in my lifetime, that we've lost millions and millions and millions of species. So that's the work that I'm really excited about right now, along with this tides and time work. I feel again like this is just the beginning of probably a multi-year, if not multi-decade project.
Wow. Well, thank you very much, Margaret. Thank you everyone for attending Art Club today, and a huge thanks to Margaret Le Jeune for presenting her amazing work.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for the questions and helping me to keep thinking about these ideas.
So be sure to tune in next month, Tuesday, May 12th at 1 p.m. when we host a group of artists for a change. It'll be a group of artists and curators to talk about the exhibition at Bradley University Gallery's Felt But Not Seen for a special presentation of that. And thanks always to our museum members and our Visionary Society members for their continued support, making our virtual museum programming possible. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.